everyone, and welcome to today's TeTra seminar. Today we have Eleanor Baker with us, who is a scholar of medieval English literature at the University of Oxford, where she teaches Old and Medieval English, and she also acts as the English subject lead for the university's foundation year. Her research focuses on historical perceptions of material texts, as well as medieval folk horror, and in extension of her scholarly work, she has co-founded the Guild of Medievalist Makers, where reflection and artistic practice go together. Eleanor has recently published a book with Bodleian Publishing on book curses. And today, in light of that topic and also right in time for autumn, she will take us back to late medieval England to explore the roles of book curses there. Eleanor, we are very excited to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Marion, thank you very much for such a kind introduction, and thank you very much for having me here at the TeTra seminar. I'm delighted to be here. Dan is going to be my technical assistant for the session and is going to be manning my PowerPoint. So I'm going to take you back to COVID by saying next slide, please, at different moments. But my presentation, my paper today is Who This Book Stealeth Shall Have Christ Curse and Myne, Middle English Book Curses and Perceptions of the Material Text. Next slide, please. So what is book curse? Book curses are maledictory inscriptions that threaten those who would steal a book deliberately or accidentally, damage a book, or sometimes those who seek to edit its contents in the hope that it will stay their hands. They have an ancient history. The earliest examples of maledictions warning against the destruction of the material text appear on the stone stelae of the oldest text-using societies, and warn against altering or effacing the cuneiform inscriptions made on the stone, or setting them alight with bitumen, with threats of punishments from various pertinent deities. As technologies of the book develop and methods of production, imagined readerships, and book owners changed, so too did the content of book curses. I've put just a few examples of book curses from some of the most ancient text-using cultures through to early and high medieval curses up to late medieval curses on the screen here. Next slide, please. As a late medievalist concerned with vernacular literary culture in England, I'm particularly interested in book curses written in Middle English between the years 1350 and 1550. Whilst manuscript production in the early and high medieval period was predominantly performed within the confines of the monastery, by the 12th century it had moved out into university cities and beyond, and even monasteries themselves had institutionalized the outsourcing to scribes and other artisans. Artisans involved in the book trade began to specialize into distinct skill groups, which would work in tandem to produce material texts, improving the speed of book production and enabling the production of different kinds of books for different book owners. This, combined with the increase in vernacular literacy rates, resulted in more people owning books. Studies of book ownership in late medieval England are siloed within particular research concerns, for example, monastery or university book records, the private collections of particular individuals or classes, such as merchants, the ownership of books in a particular geographical area. But we do know, as Teresa Weber writes, that by the 15th century, book ownership had become widely diffused within society, facilitated by the circulation of second-hand books, as well as by the use of cheaper materials and other economies. The diffusion of book ownership resulted in greater idiosyncrasy of book curses themselves, as new communities and individuals brought their own understanding of ownership, threat, and the material text to their bookish maledictions. While medievalists are often concerned with ownership inscriptions for what they can tell us about a manuscript's provenance, I'm more concerned by what they can tell us about how material texts were perceived as objects by different book owners. As George A. Kiraz and Sabine Schmidtke write of colophons, they take on a life of their own and they begin to acquire literary properties, snippets, but the nevertheless literary objects. So as a little bit of background, my doctorate looked at Middle English devotional texts and how they discuss the material text in their work. And my conclusion from my doctoral research was that, yes, they did reflect accurately the properties which late medieval books were made of, their production processes, but they often imaginatively expanded on these properties as well to make metaphors, for example, between the body and the book, or the book and holy figures. Middle English book curses range in tone and register. Some are serious and offer threats that would be perceived by those most likely to come into contact with them as earnestly menacing, for example, threatening expulsion from a monastic community to a monk, while others are more humorous in their targeted attacks because of their particularized ghoulish tortures. They appear variously in manuscripts as marginal annotations or colophons, but most commonly feature on flyleaves at the front or back of a manuscript. Many of them employ end rhymes, although it should be remembered that this rhyming would not necessarily evoke the same sense of merriment or musicality as it does for us modern readers. Rhyme was commonly employed in this period as a mnemonic. All book curses, ancient, medieval, and modern, conditional. If you do X, then X will happen. And their effectiveness is contingent on the perceived threat offered by the curse. They are inscriptions which mark a material text as being valuable to their owner or owners for both their immediate community and future readers. As Beatrice Kissinger writes, again of colophons, they witness the time and community in which a codex was made, but they also project forward to as yet unknown relationships that may be forged by working with books. Book curses, then, can help us understand how books were perceived because they were, in part, constructed precisely to deter future thieves. In this paper, I hope to show that late medieval English book curses, both instructional and imaginative, they are both literary and literal. I will argue that book curses can offer critically valuable and eminently entertaining means of considering medieval perceptions of the material text, how their material properties were understood, how the objecthood was conceived of, and how their relationship with their owners was conceptualized. Next slide, please. So just a few notes on hunting book curses. One of the difficulties of researching book curses is that they're catalogued under a variety of names which do not necessarily disclose their maledictory nature, or conversely, their value for determining provenance. I found them logged in catalogues variously as ex libris, a term which indicates the manuscript's provenance, whether institutional or individual, but not that the inscription contains a curse. Also as an ownership inscription, a term that again indicates provenance, usually by the individual, but does not indicate that the inscription contains a curse. They're also logged as anathema, a term which implies a sense of intense disapproval or threat, but which is often used interchangeably with excommunication. Indeed, the Oxford Dictionary of the Middle Ages does not contain an entry to this term and instead links back to excommunication. A great deal of book curses do threaten excommunication or anathema, but many do not. And then finally, they're often logged as lyrics or verses. Some of the book curses, especially those that rhyme, are categorized as ownership inscription verses, for example, by the Index of Middle English Verse. Each of these terms encourage catalogue readers to approach these texts with preconceptions about their usefulness in determining a manuscript's provenance, its literary value, or its relationship with religion. I think that book curse offers a useful specificity for considering this text type, and at once acknowledges its relationship to the history of the material text itself through the term book, and acknowledging the text's key definitive quality, that it is a curse. The only caveat that I would apply to this is that they do not always appear on codices, and as previously mentioned, found on stone stelae, on early medieval legal documents like wills. And although all of the examples which I have found in Middle English so far are written in books, which I'm very happy to be corrected by if someone's found them written somewhere else. So I'm now going to show you several different kinds of book curses, representing a very small number of book curses in Middle English. And I've organised them according to the perceptions of the books that they reveal. This allows me to emphasise both the conventions of Middle English book curses and their individuality. Next slide, please. I'll firstly discuss a book curse that I'm describing as an institutional book curse, as the book belonged to a university, Cambridge University College, Gonville and Keys, rather than a specific individual. I've got the Middle English on screen, but I'm just going to read it to you in Modern English. Wheresoever I become over all, I belong to the chapel of Gonville Hall. He shall be cursed by the great sentence that feloniously fareth, that takes it away and beareth me thence. And whether he bear me in hoop or sack, these are two terms which I'm going to come back to later, for me he shall be hanged by the neck. I am so well known of diverse men, but I be restored thither again. This curse is written on one of the end papers of a 14th century breviary from Gonville and Keys College. The threat offered by the book curse is twofold. It states that whoever will steal it will be cursed by the great sentence. Great sentence here meaning excommunication, which is sometimes referred to in this way, and that the thief will be hanged by the neck. These two curses threaten both the tangible effects during the thief's lifetime, excommunication resulting in being shunned by Christian society, including that of Gonville and Keys, but also perhaps in the afterlife if the thief did not repent appropriately before death. The curse gestures towards the acute consciousness that the book owners possessed regarding the hypermobility of the book and the ways in which a book could be smuggled out of the college. The term puka can refer to either a bag or a sleeve. If the remark alludes to the smuggling of books in sleeves, then it is perhaps a reference to the elongated, voluminous sleeves of the houppelande, a garment fashionable among the gentry and nobility in the 14th century during the period in which the college owned this book. You can see a couple of visual illustrations that I placed on the screen here of voluminous sleeves that are perfect for smuggling books, or the capacious sleeves of monks' cowls and frocks, which could easily conceal a book. Notably, the poetic voice of this curse is first person. It is that of the book itself. In late medieval devotional culture, there was also a literary commonplace to figure Christ's body as a kind of material text. For example, as a legal document like a charter, or the Virgin Mary's body as a kind of material text that conceives of the word. But what is happening in this example is different. The book is not being used as a metaphor for the human body, but is being afforded its own narrative voice. In doing so, this book curse is redolent of other literary examples that precede and succeeded in literary history. Consider, for example, Riddle 26 of the Exeter book, which tells of a gospel book's production process, or the It narratives of Victorian literature, which offer Bildungsroman narratives of material texts. The use of first-person narrative voice in this example is used to emphasize the book's place within the scholarly community of the college. The curse's reference to belonging, I belong to the chapel of Gonville Hall, can be read in two ways. The book can be understood as owned by the college, or belonging in the sense that it is part of the community itself. Indeed, both senses of the term were alive in Middle English at this point. Individual book ownership at Oxford or Cambridge colleges before 1500 was low. Rates vary depending on what scholars studied, but they range from as low as 4% to as high as 30% at Cambridge. So your average student would not necessarily have their own private collection of books to consult. Instead, loaning and libraries enabled their access to books. By 1500, Gonville and Keys had around 300 books, many of which are still held by the library, which represents the largest surviving medieval college library in Cambridge. It is understandable then that these valuable books were perceived as recognizable members of the community themselves, as the curse states, they are so well beknown of diverse men. Next slide, please. The next book curse I'd like to share with you is an unusual one, as the subject of the curse is named. So I've called this John Hancock's book curse. This is John Hancock's book, Whoever Say Nay, The Devil of Hell Bear Thomas Carter Away. Know how you knit, and then you may slake. So slake is release the knot. If thou knit before you know, then it is too late. This is from Durham University Library, MS Cousin V39. This riddle-like curse features in a 15th century manuscript that contains a collection of writings by Thomas Hoccleve. The poems are penned in Hoccleve's own hand, and the book was intended as a presentation copy for Joan Beaufort, Countess of Westmoreland and niece of Geoffrey Chaucer. The Thomas Carter mentioned in the curse appears to have been a cheeky scribe and is responsible for several inscriptions in the manuscript. A few folios later, he writes, "Thomas, you be a good scrivener," a somewhat debatable claim as his inscription is almost completely covered by a smudge of ink from his own writing. J.A. Burroughs and A.I. Doyle, in their facsimile of Hoccleve's manuscripts, speculate the inscription conversations between John and Thomas indicate a schoolboy rivalry, which accounts for the humorous direct attack against Thomas. The two lines after the curse itself can be understood as a riddle-like reference to marriage, with the curse warning that you should not marry someone if you do not know them, presumably in all senses. In this example, the book curse functions as evidence not only of the names of the boy scribes who had access to the book, but the literary means through which they expressed their relationship with one another. The book, in this instance, was perceived as emblematic of the friendship and rivalry of John and Thomas, and the site in which it was negotiated. Next slide, please. The book curses that I have shared with you so far were written by men and boys. Women owners were also keen cursers. The example I've put on the screen for you here is from Eleanor of Worcester. "This book is one, and God's curse is another. They that take the one, God give them the other." This is from London British Library, Harley, MS 1251. And I'm afraid I don't have the image of the book curse itself on the screen, as of course the BL outage still continues. But this is another inscription from the manuscript on the screen. This book curse sits on the back of a printed paper fragment of canon law that's been added to the front of this otherwise parchment manuscript. The manuscript itself is a palm-sized 15th century book of hours and was owned by Eleanor, Countess of Worcester, who inscribes the book several times with her name. The curse sits at the beginning of the manuscript, but a later page includes a more mild-mannered request for the book to be returned if found. And this is what you can see on screen. "This book is mine, Eleanor Worcester, and I it lose and you it find. I pray you heartily to be so kind that you will take a little pain to see my book brought home again." The curse itself, which is written in the same hand as other notes by Eleanor Worcester, features her threat as a direct exchange of thieving the book for God's curse. This curse claims Eleanor's ownership over the book, but simultaneously functions as an expression of female lay piety. Eleanor, in this curse, claims for her book the protection of God. Her book, A Book of Hours, is here understood as a devotional object, and by extension, her ownership of the book is an expression of piety. This marrying of God's curse with female lay book ownership, the curse emphasizes the influential claim first made by Susan Gragg Bell in 1982 that lay women had a significant role in the propagation of vernacular devotional practice in late medieval England and beyond. Next slide, please. The image on screen is John Simpson's bookplate. John Simpson was a keen bookplate and fishing book collector, and his 1981 bookplate reflects both of these interests. The text is written in a faux Middle English and mimics late medieval hand-coloured woodcut illustrations, and a character fishes in the foreground while a fiend clasps the spirit of a hanged man, banderole proclaiming that he stole John's book. The construction, style, and content of Middle English book curses continues to be repeated in later examples until their present day. And if anyone in the room is questioning the efficacy of Middle English book curses, it's worth remembering that I'm only able to catalogue them because they're still available today. So to some degree, the book curses, I think, work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for illuminating paper. Let me stop the sharing. And for the excellent examples we've seen through. It's a very interesting material. We've all seen in our manuscript traditions, every now and again one of these. So the floor is now open to conversation. I'm actually, before someone else jumps in, curious from what you've seen. I mean, yes, the manuscript we've working on, they're there, right? So to that extent, did they seem to have worked, but does it happen that in those that you looked at, that you find them in different places? I mean, manuscripts notoriously travel, and you know, we all work on manuscripts that seem to have been in a couple of places. So does it actually work? Did you see them? You know, curse that it mentions also a location, and the manuscript is in the other place, and or that any of the manuscripts you've been working on for this are disbanded. You know, half of it is missing, but the curse is still there. You know.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So in part, this is a the practice of writing book curses is by no means restricted to English manuscripts. It's a really common tradition in a lot of different European languages. So you do find manuscripts moving about quite a lot, and especially if people are buying books secondhand, there's absolutely nothing stopping them having a secondhand book and then writing their own inscription within them. Interestingly, I have come across quite a few examples where people have replied to a book curse by adding a further inscription. So there might be a book curse in the manuscript, and somebody has then responded. The example I'm thinking of is one by William Hott, who threatens that the devil will rot off the skin of anyone who steals this book. And somebody has replied, well, his son in the manuscript has replied below saying, William Hott gave me this book. So people are clearly believing in the efficacy of the curse enough to explain how their own ownership of the manuscript manifested. We also do have quite a lot of evidence of the expunction of curses, where curses have been scrubbed out or a line has been drawn through them. This might be a response to several things. It could be a response to the manuscript ownership changing hands. It could also be a response to I believe it's the Council of Paris in 1214 actually banned anathemas as related to material objects. However, they seem to have flourished. They became even more popular after this point, so it didn't stop anyone. But you do see those examples of expunction where somebody's maybe trying to erase the previous provenance of that manuscript. So there was some plausible deniability. The interesting case one book curse which always springs to mind in this case of how efficacious a book curse is that we have a record from a Sotheby's catalogue, I believe in 1962, where we know that there was a manuscript for sale, and the details given about it are really scant, but we know it has a book curse, but we do not know anything else about who that manuscript was sold to. So we don't have that one anymore. So in terms of how seriously these book curses were taken, it's really difficult to tell. It's also difficult in terms of to what extent were they perceived as serious threats, and to what extent were they perceived as humorous asides that deal with the materiality of the book. And I think that definitely changes over time. I think for monks writing in monasteries, where the colophons at the end dedicate it to, it's a ex dono edition that's been donated by a particular person and has a particular affinity to a particular monastic community or location. I think that probably has more efficacy if it's threatening excommunication with anathema than the more idiosyncratic book curses that we see at the end of the medieval period.
Very, very interesting. Thank you. I think Georgia and then Marion have questions.
Yeah, I do. Thank you. Thank you so much. It was very interesting, and thank you also for stressing the difficulties that but I think all of us can relate in finding information in catalogs about this kind of text form. So yeah, thanks. I really. The example, the institutional example that you brought us, it got me thinking. So I will try to make a straight question, but it's probably a bit convoluted. Bear with me.
You go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So the fact that you said the distress that the book belonged to the community got me thinking whether these courses, beside of course trying to prevent the book from moving around, we're really marking possession. So it's the other way around. More than preventing from it going around, it's really stressing the fact that this book belongs to a community. And this, like from this, I have two questions. The first one is, how big is the book? Because you said that it could fit pockets maybe, but if it's a huge, like very big size book, then we have a proof that, well, they cannot really put it into their
Yes.
into their sleeves. And the second question is, I know it's difficult to map it, but do you have an idea more or less, or can you get a general sense of what type of books were have these inscriptions? What kind of texts, if it's all religious or you have more variety? Yeah, I
Yeah,
guess.
absolutely. So to answer your first question, I think you're right. It is quite so the Gonville and Keys breviary is the one you're referring to with the houppelande sleeves. I think it would be difficult to manage to smuggle a book out like that, but equally, I don't think it would be absolutely impossible. And I think it's just a nice, insightful I think gesture towards the anxiety around storing and keeping books that are shared property. We also have interesting notes called Cortio notes from late medieval universities, where essentially books were used as collateral against a loan. And scholars would place their books in a shared chest, and then other people would take those books out to consult them. But it meant that there was the hypermobility of the book was really heightened because there was this sense of sharing. I think you're right in saying that they are definitely a proclamation of ownership. But I think the presence of the curse makes them different. We have plenty of ownership inscriptions of ex libris, for example, which don't include curses, which just state a claim to the ownership of the book. I think the curse is allowing us a greater understanding of how they perceived the book and how books were likely to move around as well. I think it's clear that in the case of Gonville and Keys, they were most worried about other members of the community taking the book away and divorcing it from its setting. In terms of the kind of books that they appear in, as you can imagine, it changes over literary history. So in the early and high medieval period, I would loosely say that you're most likely to find them in high value, not necessarily deluxe and incredibly decorated, but clearly valuable devotional and theological texts that would have belonged to monasteries and nunneries and other kinds of devotional communities. I think as the increase in literacy happened and book ownership became more readily available for people who were not working within enclosed communities, the diversity of manuscripts in which they're found in really changes. So they become present in books of secular literature, medical handbooks, books on chiromancy. I found them in books of recipes. And then interestingly, kind of later in literary history, they undergo a really distinct change. So after the kind of early modern period, they transmute from being the domain of adult book owners to being the preserve almost entirely of children. And children are the ones writing book curses in their books. We find them written in the beginning of books of fairy tales, of grammar books. So they undergo this distinct change from moving as well. So then they move into children's books. So they are in that way quite interesting snippets of text to look at for tracking readership practices and perceptions of the book over time, because you do get that change from, okay, the people who had more than pragmatic literacy, more than the ability to just write their own name and recognize what charter document was, were mainly in those sacred communities, and then it disperses outwards.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Marion?
Thank you so much, Eleanor. I really loved the examples that you showed of the book curses, and they all seem so different. And that got me wondering, and you have just now discussed this already a bit, but if I might still ask, for example, for the Syriac tradition or for other late antique and medieval traditions, we can find certain conventions in book curses, maybe certain standard references to biblical texts that you can find a lot, or certain formulations that seem to be quite classic and that scribes use. And so I was curious, with all the different types of literature that you have discussed, maybe also the different types of gender women as book owners, how do they go together with conventions or idiosyncrasy of the book curses? Did you notice any patterns there?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So the book curses in the early and high medieval period are more commonly written in Latin, and they usually come in a relatively there's some flexibility, but they usually have a relatively strict formula of saying this book belongs to the community of X. If you steal this book, you will be anathema maranatha, which is a really unusual construction. Maranatha is essentially a nonsense word. It is not a word that translates into Latin or any other language to mean anything. It was a transliteration that hasn't quite made sense but has stuck. So it becomes a kind of evocative, almost abracadabra construction of the efficacy of these words, which people thought sounded Latinate, but actually don't have a distinct meaning. So you often find this construction, anathema maranatha, at the end of these curses. And then you often get fiat, fiat, so be it, amen at the end. So they're very much phrased and constructed as being devotional gestures in their own right. They're phrased as if they were a prayer, and this is a curse that's kind of licensed by God's power, and it's written by somebody in a worshipful community, and they want the book to stay. As with the development of the form, so more idiosyncrasy happens, but you do see certain kind of commonplace expressions, often reflective of particular judicial punishments that happened in that period. So in the late medieval period, there is a proliferation of references to hanging all over the place. Some references to fire, but mostly to hanging or drowning. There's an interesting book curse which distinguishes between the punishments that should be meted out for men or women. It says that men should be hanged and women should be burned for stealing a book, which is particularly vicious. You then get, so the example that I took from Eleanor Worcester's Book of Hours, that construction of you take the book and you get God's curse in return, that's quite a common construction of that direct equation between one and the other. There are quite a few women's book curses. I found they often take that form, but we often find women's curses written by amanuensis or scribes as well. So people writing on behalf of women who own the book, but perhaps are not literate in terms of they can write themselves. So there's a famous example that others have written on of Dorothy Hellbarton's copy of the Brut Chronicle, where her amanuensis is writing in the margins, "This book belongs to my mistress, Dorothy Hellbarton. Don't steal it." Which I think is really interesting, of this kind of second-hand cursing of somebody acting on behalf of the book owner.
Thank you so much, and also really an act of trust in a sense to have someone else to, yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's what I find interesting as well, and I hesitated mentioning at the end, but book curses are really common now as well. If you go on Etsy and put in book curse, you can buy your own cursed book plates to paste in your own books, which often mimic the style of English book plates. And there's famous, it's actually it's a spoof medieval book curse by Edmund Lester that you find quite commonly appearing on these cursed book plates that you can put in your own books.
This is fascinating. Thank you.
I believe Andy has a couple of questions.
Yes, thank you very much. It's really fascinating material. I'm just curious, you spoke about how clearly these curses are considered to be valid, but do you actually have examples, cases where people were actually punished for these things? I mean, in terms of anatomization or the, well, worse, hanging, or what I can't remember what the other one was, burning. And then my second question is, you showed at the final one, you showed this image, and I was wondering, do you also have associated with these kind of curses, because it's kind of verse, do you also have associated with it some types of art sometimes, like drawings or this kind of thing?
Interesting. So in terms of kind of late medieval records for book theft and it being punished, that this is not something that I've looked into particularly closely, honestly, as to the kind of how did those punishments manifest. But we know that there were punishment, that it usually fell generally under the punishments for stealing property. So it's not necessarily distinguished from other forms of punishment. Books were expensive, valuable property. So and offered them sometimes themselves were highly valuable objects because of how they were decorated as well. So if you've got one with extraordinarily deluxe covers that have embedded jewels or they have gold clasps, they represent kind of expensive objects in that sense as well. And sorry, do you remind me of the second part of your question there, Andy?
If you sometimes have art like drawings associated with these kind of curses.
Yes, yeah, we do. Sometimes there's a great French example, whose provenance escapes me, but there's actually a little pen drawing of a man being hanged underneath. I haven't seen that many examples of drawings accompanying book curses. You do often see them accompanied by lots of other kinds of inscriptions, of ownership inscriptions throughout time, and other kinds of marginal annotations that you would find usually sitting in fly leaves and end leaves at the end. One interesting version, which it's not an illustration of the book curse, but in Trinity College in Cambridge, there is a very famous copy of Chaucer's Troilus and Cressade, and it has a really elaborate frontispiece which depicts Chaucer reading Troilus and Cressade to a kind of courtly audience. And the book curse is written on the reverse side of that page. So I think it's interesting in terms of that is an illustration which goes about characterizing the quality of the text and characterizing the envisaged audience for that book. And then you've got the book curse on the reverse.
Okay, thank you.
Very interesting. So feel free to jump in at any point. Until then, I have a couple of other questions. So one simple, how big is the corpus for the period? Should we think this is 20 of them or it's 500 on the first year? And the other question would be, well, I'll say it after.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the corpus is far larger than certainly my book conveys. It's a very, I've got it sat next to me. It makes it look like there aren't that many of them. It's quite a small book. I think we're looking at thousands. I think we're looking at thousands. And it's they're, as I said, they're kind of difficult to quantify because it's not always material that is recorded in catalogues. And when they are recorded, they're recorded in different names. So it becomes very difficult to amass. I should also say that I focused on examples that were written in English. So there is a distinct move to only looking at curses that are written in English, but I know for a fact that there is a really significant Hebrew tradition of writing book curses in books, and I will leave that to for able scholars who have expertise in Hebrew to uncover the particular traditions that go along with that. But yeah, I think they are relatively commonplace. I don't they're certainly not as commonplace as the general ownership inscriptions or colophons which you find regularly, but they are common and I think deserve to be kind of talked about when we're teaching paleography and codicology to people who are coming to medieval manuscripts for the first time, I think it's a really nice way into both understanding the provenance value of these inscriptions, but also how we consider them as literary texts as well, how we can close read them to understand more about the communities that they came from.
I see. Very, very, very interesting. And my other question would be, so these are inscriptions. To what extent, I mean, to the data that you looked at, are they contemporary with the hands in the codex itself, and or whether you've also seen, you know, couple of centuries between when the book was written and whatever the flyleaf gets attached, because they tend to be on flyleaves or on the back of something. And also, that's just popped my mind, since these are flyleaves navigate from one manuscript to another. Have you had reason to believe, when you look at one curse in one manuscript, to say this was written for a different manuscript first because it's taken out with a bunch of other flyleaves and now it's moved here?
Yeah, really great questions. So in terms of the first, so I would say again, there's probably a period split. When they're appearing as colophons, they're often included within the main body of the text itself, either at the very beginning or very end, as we understand colophons being. So they are often written in the same hand or hands as the person who has written the remainder of the text, and they are kind of embedded within the body of the text that's on the page. So they do appear slightly differently, but then we do have plenty of examples of people writing curses in later texts. So there's one that I look at, which is a early modern book curse, which is written in a late medieval manuscript. But I would say the ownership inscriptions that I've looked at so far, the vast majority of them fall within 100 years of the manuscript itself being penned. I think that's perhaps part of the reason why they were themselves penned, so that they're written at a point where the manuscript was still of optimal financial and affective value for the person who wrote the curse. So I think it being a kind of relatively fresh manuscript makes sense. But as I said before, we also have plenty of examples where curses have been passed down between family members, or somebody has then written a curse later on. And then in terms of flyleaves being extracted from other manuscripts, in my research so far, I've not found any examples of that happening, of, you know, this book curse is threatening against anyone who damages my medical text, and I found it at the back of a Bible. What's happening there? I haven't personally found that. I wonder if readers throughout literary history have kind of found pertinence in the fact that somebody's written that book curse and feel a kind of pull towards the fact that somebody's made a claim with it, and they want to keep those flyleaves together with that manuscript as kind of part of the book historical record of that piece. So no, I haven't found examples of it yet.
How about the situation where the curse says better don't be removing this book from Keys, but you're reading it now next door in Trinity or different institutions like that?
Plenty of examples of that, especially with now, you know, the vast majority of our manuscript collections are now in institutional book collections. They're not within private ownership. And I think the kind of catch-22 of this is, if it remains in private ownership, it's unlikely I'll be able to see it, and therefore, or it's unlikely that it's been catalogued, and therefore I don't know that it exists. Yes, there are plenty of examples where even like the ex dono of a manuscript, which clearly states who the volume has been donated to 400 years ago, and you read it at the British Library or the Bodleian or Cambridge University Library, and they're quite far from home.
They are. No, very, very interesting. I'm very pleased to have assisted to this paper. Andy, I think, has another question.
Yes, I was kind of curious about, we haven't really spoken about the language itself, except that, well, it's Middle English and you mentioned some kind of Latin words in there. But in terms of the Middle English, how does that work? Is there sort of, can you notice dialects, or are they really making an effort to have like, I don't know, well, now you have like Oxford English, but is there this kind of effort, or can you tell where they're coming from, or is it really sort of what's the word for it? Some kind of standard Middle English.
Yeah, a great question about Middle English. So, Middle English has plenty of dialects, and the dialects are reflected in their spelling. So there was no standardized English language as there was in France. France had a government body that ensured the standard and spelling of their language, even in the medieval period. We did not in England. So you can often tell with Middle English, or you can get a sense of where somebody was writing from, depending on the dialect they were using, because they reflected it in their spelling. So we do have some sense of that. I find it particularly interesting in Middle English. I mean, the usefulness of that as well is it again gestures towards the idiosyncrasy of those curses. If you're writing in Latin, you're writing in a standardized language to a certain extent, whereas the Middle English becomes far more reflective, as you say, both in terms of spelling and in terms of expression, as to where these curses are coming from and who they're being written by.
Yes, Yvette, please.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks, Eleanor, for a really fascinating paper. So I have one question, and you've touched on it a little bit about the difficulty in finding book curses in the catalogues. And I suppose I'm delighted to hear that from everybody, because I'm actually working with the American Library Association at the moment on creating an established term that can be used for cataloguers, because I'm a cataloguer myself in university, and to have this established term for book curses so that we can continue to try and find them with a bit more ease in our catalogue.
Oh, fantastic. You heroes.
Well, I'm hoping it works out. It is a work in progress at the moment because it's such a fascinating topic. And I tried to find myself book curses for a paper I was giving internally in our college. And I wasn't able to find a single one within the various universities I was searching. And so it kind of prompted me to do this kind of work. So you mentioned that you found these under terms like ex libris, ownership, inscription, anathema. How did you eventually discover the actual manuscript or book that contained the book curse? Did you have to go into the library or the university and scroll physically through these books to find the one you wanted? Or did you have a suspicion based on looking at a catalogue record that, oh, I think this might be one? Thank you.
Absolutely. Both. Is that, thank you for such a great question, and thank you so much for all of your effort in cataloguing to make these sources easier to find. Yes, there's often it's often, as you can imagine, in the provenance section of catalogue entries, I get a sense that something might be happening, and that they're often flagged in a very kind of roundabout expression. They're very obscure sometimes, as I'm sure you found, where it will just say there is an ownership inscription and it gives the name of the person, but there's no further detail. And then you have to go and get it out, or if you're lucky enough for it to be digitized, look online and find where the material is. I also often find that sometimes these catalogue entries don't include the full scope of the curse. So, for example, in the Durham example that I showed you on screen, the provenance section in the catalogue indicated the first two lines, but didn't include the two riddle-like lines, which are clearly written in the same hand. There's no break. It was clearly written in one fell swoop, which I would then consider part of the curse proper. That's not a separate text, but is not included in the catalogue as such. So I do think book curses are a useful term to use, just to apply that degree of specificity. As I said at the beginning, stating a text has an anathema in it, there are plenty of anathemas which have absolutely nothing to do with books. And so half of the time I was putting it, when it was live, putting into the British Library catalogues anathema, and it would come up with, oh, these are all the things in the church that you can be cursed for if you do certain things, and not an ownership inscription curse. So I think book curses, certainly for me, has been a really useful term to find. But yes, they are difficult. And it is sometimes a rather laborious case of saying, oh, I think that strange Victorian antiquary who had a stab at cataloguing this manuscript, I think they've left me enough of a trail for me to warrant ordering it up and having a look.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This was a highly illuminating paper and with very interesting material, which will make us very wary when moving manuscripts from one room to another in the library. But thank you everyone for joining, and thank you, Eleanor, for a great paper.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me and joining me this morning.
Very good. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thank you, everyone.
See you next time.
Good day.